Metro on WDET. I'm Tia Graham. In October of 2025, 32,000 home care workers in Michigan voted to secure protections and the right to unionize. Home care workers assist the elderly and people with disabilities, essential work that's needed. The win comes at a time when unions and the fight for workers' rights has taken center stage around the country. From Starbucks to Amazon, workers want to feel secure in their positions. Ethan Bakuli is an independent journalist based in Detroit. He's been following the Michigan Home Care Workers United campaign for nearly 2 years. He recently wrote in Capital and Maine about the victory and what it could mean for other professions looking to unionize. Let's just talk about, once again, there's power in numbers. You talked a little bit about just why you decided to get into, why you decided to cover this particular topic. And I want you to say it again, because I think it's important why you decided to cover it.
Yeah, so home care workers are a traditionally under-recognized, underappreciated group of people. You can also think of them as caregivers or domestic workers. These are folks who are working inside the homes of their clients, whether they be folks who are disabled or the elderly. And, historically, they've been, the industry itself has been predominantly woman dominated, tend to be older women, Black and brown women, and the wages for them is typically very low. So I thought, and the place that I was writing the story for, Capital and Maine, thought it was really important to spotlight home care workers just because what we saw this last year was over 30,000 home care workers across Michigan unionized for the first time in a decade.
Which was amazing to read through the article and this see that 32,000 people were really pushing to get protections and have themselves protected. What problem were you looking to uncover with this piece, or were you just trying to just get to the root of what was happening?
You're trying to really grasp, what does it look like to mobilize and organize folks across the entire state? I mean, it's not just here in Detroit where there are home care workers, but, you go to Lansing, you go to Grand Rapids, you go higher up, across the state closer to the UP. Like, you have folks all across the state doing this work, oftentimes with little recognition and little attention. And so we saw the organizing campaign that was happening by SEIU, the union that they ultimately joined this past year. And we just wanted to capture the concerns of folks. A lot of folks brought up stuff about the lack of wages, the 24/7 work they're doing, the limited benefits they had, no paid time off. And so we just wanted to draw attention to how, these are still people that matter, if not more so, as we're seeing a lot of people, an growing aging population, and just folks in general who need that kind of at-home support for their daily lives.
And you were just talking about it now just a little bit, though, but just this 24/7 aspect of the job itself. You spoke with Ravina Turner in the article, and Turner talks about the pressure of working full-time for a loved one or picking up other jobs. What is Turner's story, and how does it relate to so many other home care workers' stories?
Yeah, Turner's story is a really powerful one. So she always knew that she wanted to get into some kind of nursing or just giving back and caring for others. She cared for siblings, she cared for relatives. And so, by the time she was in her 20s, she was pursuing her CNA and really trying to strike out a career for that. But, she, at the same time as she was doing that work, she also had a child, and her child ended up being diagnosed with colitis. And so that really required her to be 24/7, really taking care of her daughter throughout her childhood up until her 20s now. And so it's a lot of work to take care of a family member, as most folks don't probably know. You're helping them with the medications, you're helping them to and from the bathroom, or maybe preparing their meals, or, taking them to and from appointments or hospital stays where they might be there for days and weeks on end. And so, being a home care worker, being a caregiver for any relative or any person is going to be time consuming. And, the way that the program works here in Michigan, people are funded through Medicaid, and so they're able to receive payout from that. But, Lavina at one point was making as little as $300 a month doing that kind of work to take care of her daughter 24/7 during this, and really had to rely on any support she get from relatives, as well as taking it on second jobs to be able to just, afford their life and be able to still stay at home with her daughter as much as possible.
And one of the things too that struck me or was interesting to me within the article itself was as you're talking to some of the people who are actually doing the work, who are actually home care workers, one of them said, I didn't think that I was in a position to actually fight for my right. I just expected this type of life. When you hear that and when you heard that and you're uncovering some of the things that were happening, especially when we talk about the fight to unionize, what were some of the things that you were hearing from the home care workers, health home care workers, about the, I guess you can say, dignity and power that it gave them, knowing that they had so many people fighting with them?
Yeah, folks are really isolated in this kind of work. You can imagine when you're just focusing on your relative or the client you're taking care of, it could be just you and that person for most days and most weeks. And so I think this work, and I think the process of, door knocking and canvassing, which is really how the union brought folks together, was saying, let's not just rally at the State House in Lansing, let's bring folks out in their communities, let's have them travel around the state, let's have them even travel across the country to really understand what it means to fight for, yourself, but also to fight for, other folks in your field of work. So, for the folks I talked to, it was really empowering, really gave them a sense of, like the story says, there's power in numbers. It feels better when you're fighting alongside somebody who has similar experiences. I just talked about what Ravina Turner went through, but, there are other people that she's met across the state and across the country who have had similar positions doing this kind of home care work. So I think it was just a really impactful moment for them to understand the dignity, to understand their worth, and know that they could advocate for a lot more than what they were receiving, just by way of what, the wages the state could offer, or just the lack of benefits that they've had throughout their work there.
Now, let's talk about the Michigan Home Care Workers United campaign itself. When did it start?
So this started, I'd say, probably around like 2024, late 2023. And it popped up, folks can remember after the midterm elections in 2022, when Governor Gretchen Whitmer was reelected, and we saw for the first time in about 40 years, the House and the Senate were both ruled by the Democrats. The Democrats got back in charge. So what happened there was that one of the first things that Whitmer did in her reelection bid was to restore or to repeal right to work, which had stopped a lot of union efforts. And, part of what Governor Rick Snyder had done during his tenure was to remove a lot of union protections. So already that kind of cleared the road for a union like SEIU to start a campaign like this and be able to organize home care workers. And so it really just started with like them door knocking on people who are part of this Medicaid funded program that the state had. And so it would basically just ask them, what problems are you and challenges are you facing because of the low wages you have or because of the lack of benefits you have. And they really just educated folks on, in other parts of the country, mostly in the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest, home care workers had joined the union and were able to really see improvements in their wages and their benefits through being a part of the union. So it was a lot of education work to do that. And then once that happened, the Michigan Home Care Worker United campaign pushed for a series of bills that got passed and signed by Governor Whitmer through the legislature and allowed them to both form a union or collective bargain with the state and also be able to create this authority that the state has now that basically allows them to make sure that like home care workers can have access to training, that there can be a registry. So if anybody ever needs to, take time off, they can find another home care worker that could pick up their hours or just anything else really that would be required for them to do their job and to improve at it.
And you also spoke with a political science professor at Miami University of Ohio, and he talked about how rare it was for this to be a victory within the state of Michigan, but just how rare it is for home care workers to see a win like this. Could you, if you can, explain that rarity and why it felt so rare and why this feels so huge of a win for home care workers?
Yeah, so right now this victory really came at a time where we're seeing the Trump administration administration really trying to push back on federal protections for home care workers. So one of the things that came about in the last decade was home care workers could receive at least bare minimum federal minimum wage protections as well as overtime protections. But that's been being erased. And, experts that I talked to who have been studying it for a while are saying like that's really a fear to have, for a lot of home care workers to no longer have that federal protection. So, what Michigan did effectively is provide some state protection and some state, support for home care workers, by having those laws that passed, like I mentioned before, and also by them just being able to form this union, because for at least right now, that looks like what needs to happen. But to that Miami University professor's point, I mean, the easiest comparison that he can make in his mind was like kind of seeing Starbucks workers unionizing, but on a different scale, that's talking about folks unionizing in their individual stories. Here you're talking about it's really challenging to organize an entire statewide group of home care workers who don't have a shared, workplace to really be able to claim. So folks are really just coming together who are working out of homes across the state. And so I think that's why I felt much more significant than what we've seen before, on top of just the fact that we're talking about 30,000 folks, and so the majority of folks who voted in the election that happened this past October voted overwhelmingly. I think about 70% of those folks who voted in favor of joining the union. So, when you're talking about that kind of support for a union here in Michigan, I think that says a lot about just people really wanting to have, their basic protections, as well as just, needing to have the wages and the benefits to make a living right now.
Now, you hinted at it a little bit earlier, but I do want to come back for a moment and talk about Michigan's home help program, because I'm assuming this is how a lot of the funding is being distributed to the home care workers.
Right. Yeah. So that program been able to effectively administer the money that these home care workers receive. So traditionally, that kind of operates under like whatever the state minimum wages that allows them to be paid out of that. And then there's like a little bit of an allocation that's given for direct care workers that's been increasing over the years. So right now, I think like home care workers might be making around $17 an hour. But in years past, it was 15. It was before that, it was 13. Like I mentioned with Ravina, like at one point she was just making, $300 per month according to her. So, it's this system operates to be able to provide those Medicaid funds that those clients that they're working with have. But, it's the way that it's built out really, for a lot of the folks I spoke to as a part of the union and for home care workers, it just made more sense for them to advocate for an authority to be created that would work directly between the state and home care workers in the union, so that they could, advocate for more increases to the wages that they receive, given the kind of 24/7 work that they do, on top of just making sure that, they have this access to training and to resources that they otherwise wouldn't get. I mean, there was one worker, I think, that I spoke to who was just saying, like, yeah, I didn't think I could, be a part of a union. I didn't even think I, had the credentials to do this work, because, there's for so many folks, maybe they stopped before they got a bachelor's degree, or they're able to complete their degree, but they still care about this work, and home care work is really important to them, either because they've seen their relatives do this work for their loved ones, or just because they, just care generally about helping people out in their community. So, the home help program itself really is the direct line to providing funds to these home cares.
And thinking about the Trump administration and thinking about the rollbacks to Medicaid, or the proposed rollbacks, federal rollbacks to Medicaid, but not just Medicaid, federal minimum wage, overtime protections, is all included under the umbrella for the home care workers. From your reporting and what you've been able to uncover, what are the feelings surrounding that right now, this precarious space they may be in? Because yes, on one end you're unionized, but on the other end we see some federal rollbacks that could impact their jobs.
Yeah, so I think really people, had their fears, but I think the union for them was really like the safeguard against that. And from what I heard from talking to some experts who, have been covering employment law and these kinds of things and keeping up with the National Labor Relations Bureau, like it was really important to sort of look at Nations Relations Board, I should say, they're really concerned about just states need to provide some kind of protections for their workers, for home care workers especially, just because they're generally not considered state employees, but, they do state work. They're funded out of a state-run program. They should have those protections in place, and they are providing a service that is desperately needed. So I think the fact that Michigan did this is definitely, a shining example from what, Governor Whitmer was able to do in terms of repealing right to work, and allowing folks to, begin that process of forming a union. And ultimately, now the next step for the union is negotiating with the state. So, it really all depends on, how those negotiations pan out. But having at least this union is a safeguard to say, like, even if we're not getting these basic protections federally, we can do stuff here within the state. And I think that's what SEIU themselves have sort of seen. And it's been a strategy that they've done in other states like California or Washington or in New York, where they really depend on having those state protections and really trying to negotiate with the state directly, because we never know, what might come out of, whoever is in the White House, in terms of whether or not they want to give those protections to workers or not.
And another thing, of course, I'm going straight to the article in Capital and Main, but you talk about within the article as well, just this concern right now of not enough home care workers within the field. Can you talk about retention levels right now, and if that is also something that you're hearing about on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, talking to folks like Ravina and Erica, who's also in the story, I mean, they both really brought to my attention just this concern around, whether it's their kids, whether it's young people in general, just worrying that, like, this is a field of work that people don't necessarily appreciate because of the low pay, because of just this idea we have around caregiving as a whole. And, their observations kind of reflect what we see in this country at large. I mean, the way that we haven't really put any real support or funding behind, whether it's elder care, whether it's just, palliative care, any kind of care we're trying to give to folks, says a lot about what we as a society really think about how folks should be treated or taken care of, whether it's, as you get older in age, or just because, you might be living with a disability that really hurts you from being able to move or live your life independently. So I think for all of them, they really hope that this unionization movement could inspire both, their family and their loved ones and people around them too. And it already sounded like it had. I mean, talking to Ravina, she had mentioned, it was really great to see, her family and her friends really rally around her work and be more educated and understanding of it. And, she came from a union family, so, it's not anything new to them, but I think still just folks really understanding for this particular line of work, for home care workers, for caregivers in general, like, let's give them the same respect and the same dignity that we ascribe to other, industries that, are traditionally, thought of as blue collar or traditionally thought of as, very union backed.
And one of the themes within the article, There's Power in Numbers, is just this idea that there's a blueprint now for grassroots organizations or just, folks who are not protected and want protections to go find and fight for a union or fight to be unionized. How do you see a win like this being a blueprint for grassroots organizing, especially when we think about just big changes for workers and employees?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it in the last, couple of years. Folks were talking a few years back, hot labor summer. I think folks are really, organizers, especially unions, especially seeing we're in this real moment where folks clearly are, whether you're living through the impact of inflation, whether you're just living through the impact of these tariffs or what have you, it's really important for workers to really feel their sense of power and to feel they can actually, be doing something to shift to sort of, a really difficult economic situation that they're in. So, I mean, I think really I think what SEIU did in this moment that probably resonated a lot with workers was just speaking to a lot of like very basic kitchen table, politics and conversations that we will all be having, about just like, how can I afford to pay my bills? How can I afford to, cover my groceries? How can I afford just like my entire life and like staying in my home? And I think for home care workers who make up such a large number here in Michigan as well as in other states, I think for them, it felt so good to see that reflected in a campaign that wanted them to lead charge with it. So folks like the home care workers I spoke to they were not traditionally public speakers. They did not desire to want to be on this kind of platform and to, put themselves out there and really talk about their story or tell their story. But other than the fact that the campaign itself really encouraged and pushed them to think about just ways that they could, be able to actually improve their condition without really waiting on anybody to help them out. It really all came down to them showing up and showing out and really, encouraging their other home care workers to see the power of starting a union. So I think that's something that's definitely translatable. I mean, we're seeing it when people really want to take to the streets and, come together to see or change any issue that they think is really, causing an impact in their life.
Ethan Bakuli is an independent journalist based in Detroit. Coming up, a conversation with Detroit musician Tariq Gardner about how he developed his sound. You all stay right there. This is The Metro.